Good afternoon. Welcome to this session. It's called Delivering a Global Energy Revolution. And we have two panellists who know a lot about the subject to discuss it with us. So first of all, we have John Morton, who in April was appointed as the US Treasury's first climate counsellor, reporting to Janet Yellen. In addition, we have Jeremy Oppenheim, who's co-founder of SystemIQ, which you all know. Jeremy spent 20 years at McKinsey, and he's chair of the Blended Finance Task Force. So thanks both for joining us. Now, one of the themes of COP26, as you will have seen, is there's a lot of focus on net zero 2050 or India 2070, but a key focus is on what we're going to do in the next 10 years in order to stick to the climate budget, the carbon budget. So from your perspective, what are the key things that we really need to do to stay on track, make sure we don't kind of miss the boat?
It's a good question. It's a big question. I think we come into this COP, first of all, in a very different place from any other. And I think the biggest perhaps differentiator from this COP from previous ones that I've been at is both the momentum of public finance that has been committed in the lead up to this COP, and the corpus of private finance that has aligned itself to support net zero goals globally. So over the course of the last even 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen billions and billions of new public commitments, including from our own government, where our president doubled an already doubling of our public finance commitment. And we've seen investor coalitions like Gfans come together and commit $130 trillion around net zero transition. Now, how do you take those 2050 commitments and make them real is the question that you're asking. And I think that is absolutely the focus. That needs to be the focus of the next 12, 24 months leading into the next COP and beyond. We now have capital prepared to invest. We now have 90% of global GDP that has made national net zero commitments. And the question is, how do we unlock that capital as quickly as possible? We have ideas. We have good policies.
What's the answer?
And we need more. Well, the idea is that every country needs a long-term strategy. And that long-term strategy puts in place policy incentives, puts in place regulatory incentives to support those transitions. When those strategies are clear, capital that needs to invest in order to satisfy their net zero commitments are going to follow quickly. So we have the building blocks now, and now the question is, how do we lean forward, be more specific about investment needs, not just in developing countries, but in developed countries, and align those two things. I'm very confident about our ability to do that. The U.S. is positioning over the next, hopefully, week or two, 2 large bills that collectively will position almost $1 trillion worth of public finance, by far the largest investment in our history, in supporting the technologies and the enabling technologies to drive this transition faster. So I'm confident about where we're heading.
Okay. And Jeremy, how do you think about this issue?
Well, building on what John said, so no kind of violent disagreements. The heart of this, over the next 10 years, is going to be how we transform the energy system. And that is a 2-part story, and there are thousands of subparts within it. But one is the supply side, and that is all around how we, if you will, scale up clean electrons across the planet. So it's driving up electrification we want to electrify the whole economy over time, but it is radically increasing the share of clean electrons, and that will largely be renewable. It will not only be renewable, and of course it has to include the grid infrastructure, it has to include the storage infrastructure, the smart optimization network. There is a huge investment, if you will, and we know what that investment looks like. This is not a mystery. It's not like we have to.
The IEA has put a number on it, for example.
We understand both the big numbers, the small numbers, the components. We don't have enough plans and specific projects in all the economies where we need them. But there's a supply side revolution that can, with the technologies we have today, unfold and absorb billions, in fact trillions of dollars of long-term capital from pension funds into safe assets that are at the heart of any good clean economy going forward. The second side is on the demand side. So energy systems work because you change the demand side as well as changing the supply side. And the demand piece of this is that in some sense, the bit that's lagging behind, but where there's a huge, if you will, opportunity to start catching up. And the obvious tipping point, the positive tipping points there, are coming through first on the transport sector and first with, obviously, personal transport and the way in which our mobility systems are going to pull through, right, the demand for clean electrification, and are then going to fuse with the supply side.
Do you think the governments are doing enough on that specific demand issue, kind of getting down demand? You know, the UK is doing something about cars, other countries, but like, do you think in general?
Right, so I think in general, I think the mental model that governments have remains heavily oriented to the supply side. And let's be clear, there's been real progress, so I don't want to knock it, right? But demand is king. If you want system change, not just to kind of, if you will, clean up a bit the system we've got, but if you want deep, profound system change, it will come overwhelmingly through demand-side changes. And that is where governments can come in with a combination of mandates, regulations, incentives, the right public capital deployed together with private capital. There's no one silver bullet on the demand side. You've got to work the whole thing. But what you see is fantastic progress from the private sector. Right? You get the big customers coming in and saying, you know, it's not enough to, if you will, have an electric vehicle. That electric vehicle's now got to be, you know, net zero life cycle style, right? And that therefore means I need to have green steel, and that therefore means I need to have and it's those, if you will, flywheels on the demand side where you get both private sector but also public sector. Your big infrastructure bill, that's huge amounts of public sector procurement.
Absolutely.
Right? Do we put that into clean infrastructure, right, with the, if you will, moving up the share of low carbon or net zero cement, right, and green steel and the like? Or do we just go, oh, we don't care, we're just going to play it on the supply side? And I'm hoping that these big government programs, together with big, if you will, the major companies, can create these demand-side tipping points that'll be absolutely central to
John, do you have a kind of view on to Jeremy's point, like this huge amount of money, public money, and all the Gfans money, what should it be spent on? I mean, you know, there's some schools of thought of just, you know, throw as much money into investment in kind of, you know, green technology and things that, you know, magic things to suck carbon out of the air, that kind of thing. Or do we need to focus more on just the kind of nuts and bolts of getting out of coal, things like that?
Well, I think we need to do both, and I think this is the question of, you know, what is the how heavy should the hand of government be in determining the choosing the winners and losers? I think the most important thing that we can do, and I think the president has done that, and our president has done that, and our Secretary Yellen has done that, is to indicate clear direction of travel and intentionality around the transition to a low carbon economy. I think when capital markets and investors and companies understand that carbon is a increasing liability on their balance sheet, and that high carbon intensity products are likely to come under higher scrutiny and down the road are likely to be potentially penalized. We've seen from the EU its own movements on carbon border adjustments and things like that. Those market signals, I think, are absolutely important. And getting back to Jeremy's point about the electrification of vehicle fleets, for example, you don't need 100 countries to commit to banning the internal combustion engine in order to have a systemic change in the vehicle fleet. You need 5 or 6 large countries to do that. You need 5 or 6 big markets to do that, and that really pulls forward the transition at a much faster rate. So I think what we're beginning to see is large, significant economies sending extraordinarily clear both signals of directionality with respect to their NDCs, but also with respect to their industry-specific plans, notably in the transportation sector, but increasingly in hard-to-abate sectors like cement and steel and the chemical industry. And as those signals are sent further, I think you're going to see a natural and rather fast reallocation of capital towards cleaner, greener initiatives. Our infrastructure bill is a good example of that. We're seeking to both send signals and incentivize production in cleaner and greener technologies that will drive the transition.
I think it's a wonderful example, by the way. On the shipping side, you know, you need a dozen ports, right, and half a dozen major, if you will, shipping lines, and you get to a tipping point, right? And that will then pull through, if you will, the shift in the fuel mix that will be needed. And will it happen overnight? No. But John's point is that this is about absolutely clear direction, absolutely clear realignment of expectations. Right? This is an expectations game because that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
And what you hear the activists, and I consider myself amongst them, complaining about is when you get mixed signals. When you've got, the signals are going here, but then we send a different signal in the opposite direction.
Right.
Let's continue to expand.
We still have fuel duty in the UK, for example.
Whatever, right? Or we're going to cut the tax on domestic aviation. These things that send mixed signals that then lead the market to go, is the government for real? Right? Is it absolutely committed?
Yeah.
Are the things that not only make it hard to, if you will, get the transition to work in the way that I think we need to with the private capital really coming behind public capital, but it raises the cost of capital because it increases risk for everybody. And as you increase the risk and you increase the cost of capital for a transition that inherently is capital intensive, you blow the thing up.
Yeah, so what about this Gfans commitments? I mean, the 130 trillion, I mean, sadly it's not immediate, like, it's been reported as if it's like, right, we've got this ready to go. I mean, it's the balance sheets of these big big banks, asset managers, but like, it's kind of contingent on them setting kind of targets, doing what they said they were going to do, and staying in this club and committing to 1.5. Do you think that? Are you confident that's actually going to happen? You know?
I mean, my response to that is: would you prefer to live in a world where 130 trillion of capital hasn't made a net zero commitment, or would you prefer to be in a world where they have? And the question is, okay, guys, how are you going to get there? And we're in the latter world now, which I think is a far better place to be. Taking Gfans as an example, it's not just mid-century net zero targets, it's mid-century goals with 2030 targets and annual reporting back on how they're doing against those targets. And so it has a very clear accountability and reporting structure. Now, how will that work? I don't know, but I think it will work well, and I think there'll be a race to the top as opposed to a race to the bottom, which is what many people feared would happen in climate finance. Where there'd be leakage in the system, and there'd be triage between assets that were good assets and hidden assets over here. Now we have literally 40% of the world's assets under management are committed to net zero. That number will increase. We need to make sure and work with the investors and work with the operating companies, importantly, underneath those investors, to design and help promote clear net zero transition plans for industries. At the end of the day, banks need to, and financial institutions need to invest in assets.
Right.
And those assets need to have clear plans. And that's really the focus that Jeremy's mentioning on maritime, on chemicals, on oil and gas, on steel.
What a bonanza for investing in the new economy. Right? I mean, we're going to have to retool, frankly, the global economy, right? And that is where capital can go at scale. I mean, the one thing I'd say on the Gfans front is that, and I'm completely with John's view that let's have them on our side, right? Right. That changes the game and it changes the conversation, because we get into a conversation about how to make this practical, right? So that 100+ trillion delivers. And one of the things that I think really still needs work is the fiduciary duty that is held by the trustees of pension funds. Right. And I know it's tough territory, and it shouldn't be tough territory. It should be the most obvious territory of all. These are
particularly an issue in the States.
It's particularly an issue in the States, and I know it's a contentious issue, but I think a conversation like this should not shy away from the contentious issues. That one, I cannot understand how a pension trustee could have a fiduciary duty, right, on a long-term liability that they hold, right, that is somehow decoupled from climate risk, and Mark Carney gets it right. Climate risk equals investment risk when it comes to long-term assets. There is no case, right, for any further investment in new carbon-intensive long-term assets. Full stop.
Have you got any thoughts on that?
What I would say about that is, Secretary Yellen oversees something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is, in her role as Treasury Secretary, she convenes on a regular basis the independent regulators within our financial regulatory system. Her first convening of that group in March was around climate, and climate exclusively. She convened the group to say, what are you thinking about when it comes to climate-related financial risk in the system? The president then issued an executive order about 2 months later, charging the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, to come back within 6 months with a report on how they are incorporating climate risk into their activities. This is the SEC, the FDIC, the Fed, all of our alphabet soup of regulators. They have just done that. And they found, and the headline finding was that climate change constitutes an emerging and increasing risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system. Where they go next is clearly laid out in the FSOC recommendations and report, and they have committed to making this issue front and center priority for them over the coming year. I think you will see action out of our regulators in the months ahead.
Okay. This is something of a hypothetical question, but what exactly happens to this all the signals that's being sending from COP if we get a different president in the next time round?
That really is a question for John.
I'd like to hear your views, Jeremy. Look, under the Trump administration, U.S. emissions continued to fall. Coal closures in the U.S. were faster under the Trump administration than they were under the Obama administration. The economics of climate change are compelling a rapid shift in our systems. The Secretary has said that climate change poses an existential threat. It also poses a historic economic opportunity. U.S. businesses and U.S. policy is increasingly positioning itself around both protecting ourselves from the worst impacts of the threat of climate change, but also aligning ourselves to be more competitive in the industries that will clearly dominate the future. And the job creation, the wealth creation that's embedded in this transition to a low carbon economy, I think is going to continue to drive U.S. policy and decision making, irrespective of party.
Okay.
I think if I can, for a slightly different frame on this, which is if we pursue policies that lead to uncompensated job losses over the next 3 years, or policies that lead to price volatility in the energy markets, right, that is unthought through, right, then we increase the risks of what you've just described.
Okay.
Right?
Well, I think...
and I think we've just got to be smart and wise, right? I mean, yes, there is the deployment of capital in all the ways we've talked about, but if we ignore the one word that we haven't used in this conversation so far, which is its impact on people.
Okay.
Right. Then we will lose.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you very much to panelists John Morton, Jerry Oppenheim.